The final lie is Usopp's hammer. Let's get into it. So, in One Piece, Usopp has had a running theme of telling lies and those lies becoming true. When he was a child, he said he fought dragons and giant moles and Cerberuses. We've seen all those things in the story in real time. There was a Cerberus in Thriller Bark, Miss Merry Christmas was a mole in Alabasta, and there have been several dragons both in Punk Hazard and in Wano. So it's safe to say that all lies do become truth. With that being said, even if you want to go even further, Soki King technically exists because one of the fake Straw Hats dressed up as Soki King. Moving on though, what is a lie that hasn't been brought into a truth yet? Well, in Alabasta and in Thriller Bark, Usopp has this move in which he takes out this giant, unbelievably heavy hammer and strikes an opponent with it. The idea behind said hammer is that after bragging about how heavy the hammer is, the opponent faints from the shock from being hit with it, simulating in their minds that the hammer is actually as heavy as Usopp described it to be. Though we know this is not the case because it's usually a balloon with some pans in it or something. It's never an actual hammer. So how can this unbelievably heavy hammer become reality? Well, I think if we do go to Elbaf, which I hope we do because goodness gracious, are there a lot of characters tied up into Elbaf. I mean, Big Mom, Usopp, Robin, potentially. There are a lot of characters tied up in Elbaf. So if we go to Elbaf, here's what I think will happen. Since Elbaf is going to be rooted in Norse mythology, or we can at least assume that it's going to be rooted in Norse mythology, there's a very interesting character in the Norse mythology that kind of parallels with Usopp. There is a squirrel that runs up and down the great tree Yggdrasil in Norse mythology, and he's a bit of a trickster. He's a bit of a liar. He hates the world tree, and he is constantly starting up beef between the eagle and the Nihog, the serpent at the roots of the tree, in hopes that one of them will tear the tree down, okay? So he tells lies, he starts up stuff, which is what early Usopp did. I think since Elbaf will be rooted in Norse mythology and we already have a guy named Loki, I propose that somewhere on Elbaf, perhaps in the Royal Guard, perhaps he's a pet, I think there's going to be a hammer. However, this giant's hammer, this unbelievably big hammer, is going to be a devil fruit user. I don't think it's going to be anything mythical like that. I think it's just going to be a red squirrel. A hammer would have eaten a red squirrel fruit. Said squirrel perhaps is mischievous in some way. Perhaps he is a troublemaker. Let's just say the squirrel is mischievous, right? I think the squirrel, who is actually a hammer, will strike up a bond with Usopp along the Straw Hats' journey in Elbaf. And then once they leave Elbaf, he'll just become a permanent tool in Usopp's kit. The difference here is that based on how weird item zones are, I think no matter how heavy the hammer is, Usopp will be able to wield it because of the weird size difference between the squirrel being a regular squirrel and the hammer being large. And you get this weird discrepancy in size manipulation with item zones when you consider Spandam and Frunkfried. Frunkfried is a giant white elephant, yet Spandam can wield him as a sword, and it doesn't really matter what state he's in. So perhaps it works the opposite way when the weapon is big and the animal is small, and in such a way that Usopp can use the hammer, even though it's a giant hammer, and strike opponents, but to him, the hammer weighs as much as the squirrel. We don't have a confirmation that it could work that way, but I'm proposing that, seeing as how item zones work on this very weird floating logic, and they can seemingly do a lot of things Remember, for example, Smiley? He was gassed that ate a axolotl fruit, yet he had kind of Logia abilities, and he could even split himself up into multiple beings. Very, very strange. So I'm proposing that this could be the case for this unknown Ratatasker equivalent in One Piece. Perhaps this squirrel is able to be wielded like a normal hammer because of the weight discrepancy between the hammer's actual size and then the size of a red squirrel. And that would be the completion of the lie that the hammer weighs 10 tons or 100 tons, because it actually would. Not to Usopp, but to the person he's hitting. And then probably the narrative would shift between people being scared by the grandioseness of the hammer to calling Usopp's bluff, but being surprised that the hammer actually weighs that much. Which kind of reminds me of when Luffy did Gear 3rd for the first time against Lucy, and Luffy said, "My arm is now the size of a giant," and Lucy was like, "Well, that's just a balloon, that's not going to be effective," and then he found out. So I think it's going to be the same thing here. People are going to shift from taking Usopp's word to calling it nonsense and trying to challenge the hammer, only to find out that the hammer is real. This could also be a situation in which the hammer itself is legendary and then the fruit is not. So perhaps it's a legendary hammer that ate a mundane fruit instead of a mundane hammer who ate a legendary fruit. Or a mythical zone, I should say. But yeah, I think it's going to be one of those instances in which you have a giant hammer that has eaten a squirrel fruit, and then the hammer who's eaten a squirrel fruit will become Usopp's traveling companion. And if he is a caretaker of the giant tree that we see in Big Mom's flashback, if he's a caretaker of that tree, he doesn't necessarily have to be a messenger, but if he's a caretaker of that tree, that would mean that the squirrel has some background in botany. So perhaps he could organize Usopp's bag and help him with his pop greens. Or the tree that we see in Big Mom's flashback, which could be the Adam tree, perhaps that has a whole new like breed of pop greens that the squirrel has collected, because we know squirrels collect nuts and berries. So even if he doesn't do that as a hobby, I would imagine that would still be a very useful companion to have to use as a sorting item to organize Usopp's animal. Also, it would be a great companion to have on the ship to take care of Usopp's pop greens and their guard that they have. Another creative use of the squirrel would be to use it as an ammunition shot. Therefore, when the squirrel is close to the target, it would transform back into a giant hammer and completely decimate who was ever being shot at. And that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching. If you like stuff like this, please feel free to check out my YouTube channel, Pauly P Works. And if you like what you see, I would appreciate your subscription. Thank you so much. See you next time.